So today we're going to talk about export controls. Specifically, we're going to focus on the ITAR and EAR requirements. This last update on this slide was 2021, but since that, there's been no major changes to the ITAR EAR, nothing that would have made its way into the slide. So first thing we'll talk about is, we want to define what we're going to talk about. And really what we're talking about today is exports and export compliance. So what is an export? When we talk about that, we're talking about the physical shipment of goods or items. I think that's the most intuitive version of an export that most people understand. The one that tends to get more people caught off guard is the electronic or digital transmission of goods or items. This can be the emailing of technical drawings, other information. The release of specific technical data to a foreign national. I think that most people are kind of aware that that's what these laws are designed to prevent, is that export to foreign nationals. And then access by a foreign national of any covered technology. So this is where you would have like controls for who's allowed in your shop and what they're allowed to see when they're in your shop and what kind of firewalls to have in place, etc. We'll dive into all these here in just a moment. So what are export controls? They're just the U.S. laws and regulations that govern the distribution to foreign nationals in foreign countries of strategically important products, services, and information for reasons of foreign policy and national security. So that's a long-winded way of saying it's the way we control keeping our secrets out of the hands of people we don't want them to have, right? Obviously we wouldn't want to share military technology with someone that we are, in an active conflict with, or we have an embargo with, etc. The purpose of the regulation, well, it's to implement that foreign policy goals and objectives. A big one is to prevent terrorism. We don't want to support, terrorists getting their hands on things that are going to allow them to be better terrorists. We want to restrict the export of goods and technology that can contribute to adversary military potential. We kind of touched on that. And we want to restrict goods and technology that could damage the vitality and critical interests of the U.S. economy. So, that one is, that can be a lot of things, right? I mean, we don't want to give away secrets that are going to just take away our ability to be successful business as the United States, right? And then we want to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological, and nuclear. So things like, uranium and plutonium are going to be things that are going to be export controlled. We're not going to just share those things freely. Who oversees it? Well, we've got a couple of departments that oversee export control laws. Department of State typically is the most strict, and because they deal with the ITAR. ITAR is the International Traffic in Arms, and it's it deals with inherently military properties. So bombs and guns and jets and things like that, tanks, armor. That's going to fall under the ITAR. Department of Commerce, they are a lot easier to work with. There's a lot more exceptions on what you can export and to whom. And they deal with these dual use technologies. So when we talk dual use, we might be talking about communication devices. So like walkie-talkies or similar devices that could have a military application, but they also have an application in just the private sector, and they kind of fall in that dual use category. Now, some of that stuff we want to restrict who can have access to it, because if it does have that dual use, we don't want people to potentially use it to listen in on things that they shouldn't be hearing or transmit things that that cause interference or problems. And then there's the Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Asset Control, and they're going to prohibit transactions of value with certain countries and individuals. That's who's going to invoke sanctions and such, right? So we're, right now we've got sanctions, with Russia, and there are a lot of companies. Well, every company should have stopped transacting, with Russia and providing them assets, unless they've got some exclusion or some provision that allows them to do that. When we talk about the 3 different departments, we've got this table that kind of says, which laws are kind of the governing laws or regulations and requirements managed by each department. So the Export Administration Act, Export Administration Regulations, and the Commerce Control List are all overseen by the Commerce Department. The Arms Export Control Act, ITAR, and the U.S. munition lists are governed by the State Department, and the Treasury Department oversees trading with the Enemy Act, the Iraqi sanctions, regulations, terrorism sanctions, and they have a list of specially designated nationals and block persons. So you're going to find there, kind of refer to that as like the blacklist, right? If you get blacklisted, this is where you go. If you're been caught selling secrets or doing things that would violate the expectations of these departments. We're going to talk about ITAR a little bit. So the ITAR is, the requirements for ITAR are defined in 22 CFR Part 120 through 130. That's a documented set of requirements that detail out all the ITAR rules and regulations. Items controlled by ITAR are going to be listed on the U.S. munitions list, the USML, and it contains the military items or defense articles, including technical data, unlike EAR, which we'll talk about here in a moment. It furnishing technical services, assistance, including design, engineering, and use of defense articles, which are all controlled. It's based primarily on whether or not an article or service is deemed to be military in character. So that's what we were talking about. The ITAR is relative to military or defense. EAR, Export Administration Regulations, those are controlled by 15 CFR, Part 730 through 744. Again, that's your list of requirements there. And they are going to, their items are going to be listed under the CCL, the Commerce Control List. It's going to contain all those dual use commodities. So again, some of those are capable of military or commercial or both use. And they might have things like technology, software, et cetera, and they're, that are subject to the EAR. And they're identified by an export classification control number, ECCN. So if you're looking to export these items, there's some documentation you're going to have to fill out, and you're going to have to identify your ECCN by going through that CCL list. The licensing is handled by the Bureau of Industry and Security, or BIS. It's formerly the Bureau of Export Administration. Inherent capabilities and design, not the end use, determines whether or not the item falls under ITAR or EAR. So it might go, you might have a product that is not inherently a defense item, but it has a certain capability or a design that could be applicable to, as a defense item, that might land it in that ITAR category. Otherwise it may land in the EAR, may land in nothing if it doesn't fit in those categories. And then the last one we talked about a little bit was the Department of Treasury, Office of Foreign Assets Control, or OFAC. And no, that's not just what you say when you get in trouble for violating the ITAR and EAR requirements. They're going to manage and govern economic sanctions focused on end user or country rather than the technology. And they may limit the transfer of technologies, assistance to the OFAC list of sanctioned countries. They're going to cover and govern prohibitions on trade with countries such as Iran, Russia, and they have a pretty substantial list of other countries. They're going to define limitations on activities in certain areas of countries where with certain non-state actors. So the non-state actors, it's an entity or a group that is non-US. They're not considered a US entity. The OFAC prohibits payment or providing value to nationals of sanctioned countries to specified entities, even if the country is not subject to sanctions. So, we've got this, a couple of examples here. So, did we go backwards here? Sorry, something's happening here. Let's stop that. Talk about this. Talk about that. There we go. Difference between ITAR and EAR. ITAR covers, again, military items or defense articles. That includes most space-related technology due to the application to missile technology. It also includes technical data related to defense articles and services. So when we talk technical data, that could be, that could be blueprints, it could be 3D models, it could be spec sheets, it could be a lot of things, right? Any kind of technical data that describes that defense article. And again, they're very strict. There's not much latitude when we're talking about export exceptions under the ITAR. Very few exceptions to that. EAR, again, regulates the dual use. They have 10 CCL categories. That's their list of dual use items. It includes test equipment, test materials, software, and technology. They regulate items designed for commercial purpose, but that can have military applications. So here are a couple more examples, right? Computers, pathogens, and civilian aircraft are good examples that, they're not really designed for military, but they certainly could be weaponized. They cover goods, test equipment, materials, and the technology or technical data and assistance, as well as software. They cover the re-export of foreign commodities incorporating U.S. origin control items outside of the U.S. So, re-export is when we've incorporated something that we've made here in the U.S. Into something, and then we're going to re-export it out. Right? And they are they're a lot easier to work with. Again, there's 10 categories. There's a lot more exceptions on what we can send out for EAR. Even though computers may fall under that category, there's we ship computers out of the country all the time. So that's kind of an indicator of there being some levity there. A deemed export. Deemed export. Oh, did we skip a slide? Yes, we did. Deemed export. Export controls cover transfer of goods and technology within the U.S. to a foreign national who is not a U.S. person. So what that means is a deemed export is someone, an individual who is non-U.S. person. We'll talk about what a U.S. person versus a non-U.S. person is here in a minute. Who you've either given goods or information to that should have been controlled, like under the ITAR or EAR. This one gets most companies. This is the one that kind of gets most people tripped up on or caught, with non-compliance, because it's very easy for you to set up a supply chain, for instance, and maybe you've got a vendor that you've always done business with, and you don't think twice about shooting him over email, right? He's Bob. He's worked in the U.S. forever. You maybe met him. He may have even shown his ID, but sending that email, if it wasn't on a U.S. server, well, this act of sending that email meant that it may have pinged off of a satellite in Canada. Well, Canadians are non-U.S. persons, right? That data was then deemed export. It was sent to somebody that it shouldn't have been. Or maybe Bob is Canadian and you just didn't know that, right? And he's making parts for you. Well, you sent him the blueprint so he could give you a quote. Use a deemed export. So who's responsible for that? Well, the company who is sending, or the entity who is sending the information, is responsible for the way they handle that information. It's we're talking about laws and regulations. So like any other law, right? The person who's breaking the law is the responsible party, right? The driver of the speeding car is responsible, not its passengers. So again, that's the one that kind of gets people, finding themselves non-compliant. We'll talk about what happens if you do find yourself non-compliant here in a little bit. Deemed exports can apply to research assistants, students visiting foreign researchers, U.S. citizens visiting a foreign country. It does not apply to U.S. citizens or permanent resident green card holders. So this one is one that confuses a lot of companies as well, right? They have green card holders that apply or want to work at their company, and then they're really not sure how to handle the ITAR, well, or the EAR, whatever the export requirement is. If they're a green card, the law looks at them as a U.S. person. So, if they've come here legally, they've gotten that documentation, they're good to go. You can share that information with them. If they haven't done that, again, you gotta have controls. Doesn't mean they can't be in your building. You just have to have controls to isolate them from seeing the technical data, handling the product, Yeah.
Question, Derek.
Yes, sir.
So what happens, so there continues to be more instances where foreign nationals are involved in R&D in some capacity, especially in university, and information is exfiltrated.
Yeah, so again, the organization or the entity who is providing that information is ultimately responsible for what happens to it. So if you've allowed foreign nationals into your university or into your business, and they end up with technical data or secrets or product that is controlled, that's a violation, right? And that's something that if you find out about, you've got some obligation to report. There is definitely a difference between a willful violation and a lapse in controls or an absence of controls that lead to these disclosures. Like anything, the law is written the way it is, and if the right judge or the right group decided, hey, we're gonna hold your feet to the fire, well, they could, but it's typically not the case that they're going to aggressively pursue somebody who just had a lapse of controls or a lack of control. They might put you in a predicament to where, hey, look, we know you have these non-compliances, and depending on who you are and what your leverage is in the community or in the industry, they might actually put you in a position to help them out. That's kind of a common practice that they've done with businesses who found themselves non-compliant. There's a pretty big case of a company in the Northwest. They make some thermal imaging devices, and they were hit with something like 300 violations under somehow the ITAR got wind that they were non-compliant. They got hit with 300 some odd violations, and they weren't willful violators by any means. They were just they didn't know what they were doing wrong, therefore they continued to do it for a long period of time. Well, the FBI got involved, the BIS got involved, there was an investigation, and they said, okay, look, we know you guys aren't selling secrets to our enemies, but you are allowing these bad practices to happen. And within your group of or within your industry or your sector, we do know of some bad guys, and we're gonna use you to help us find these bad guys. So they set up some sort of sting, use the company as as a way to communicate with these bad guys and get some illegal activity to happen in a controlled sense, and they were able to capitalize on that, take down the bad guys, and that was what they used to kind of resolve this non-compliance, rather than hitting them with $1 million fine 300 times, right? They worked with them, they got them cleared up. Depending on who you are, depending on how much they find and what they need from you, that might be an avenue they take. It might be a thing where hey, they just it was an accident. You might have to pay a penalty or a fine or something, and they reduce it down, just like any other crime, right?
Sure.
You go in front of a judge for.
May I pose another question?
Sure.
Okay. So am I correct in understanding that a third-party entity does not have a duty to inform under ITAR, but that the entity that provides the access to control data is therefore the management is obligated to inform, but may choose not to?
So let me make sure I understand that right. So I'll just put it in a scenario base. I own a company. I'm the entity who has this data. I administer it to my management team, for instance, and then my management team goes out and, gets quotes and works with vendors and so on. And somewhere in that chain, there's a leak, and it gets in the hands of somebody it shouldn't be. Does that so far sound like what you're talking about?
That's fine so far.
Okay, so once that leak is identified, the person, the entity who identified it, has a requirement to report that.
Even if they're not employed by the entity, but that was the aspect of the third party scenario.
I believe the way the export compliance law is written is that if you become aware of it, you have a legal requirement to report it.
Even if you're a third party doing work on behalf of the entity.
I believe that is the way it's worded. I don't know how much they can enforce at that level, or that they do enforce at that level. But the wording is that if it is observed that there's been a violation, that the observer has a responsibility for reporting.
Okay. Thank you.
No problem. And we so jumping back into the slide, we talked that it doesn't apply to the U.S. citizen or permanent resident and who those people are. But some things that are examples of deemed exports could be like these visual inspections, emails, which we touched on, or even oral exchanges of information. This one surprisingly gets overlooked as well. A lot of people will put in, they'll have like a conference, or they'll have a large meeting that they won't do a review to see if there's any non-US persons or foreign nationals in the group, and then they'll start talking about the secret stuff that they're doing inside their shop. Now in universities, it's kind of a broad statement here, or a blanket statement that says basically there's no effect on about 90% of university research, since most of it's fundamental or basic research. Meaning if you're going to teach math or physics or things like that, yes, there can be an application of, physics, applied to a military application, but the fundamental training of physics is not controlled under the ITAR and EAR. That said, there are some potential impacts. Sharing of data, materials, or software. So there's kind of specific things. They can be impacted, or they can affect your compliance. Certain classroom lectures, again, the exchange of oral information can be considered an export. Collaborations, discussions with professional colleagues. Again, that's usually going to be that oral, possibly written discussion. The ability of foreign students to participate in research involving controlled technology. That mostly applies to the ITAR. So, there are a lot of schools and universities out there that they're working on military stuff as a form of education. So you have to have those controls. Ability to provide services, including training on the use of controlled equipment to foreign nationals, ITAR, EAR, or OFAC can be applicable there. And the ability to send controlled equipment to foreign countries, ITAR, EAR, and OFAC are potentially impacted there. Dissemination of information. So laws and regulations prohibit the disclosure without a license from commerce or state of controlled technology information by any method to a foreign national in the US or abroad. So again, that even though they're here, if they are a deemed export, they're not a US person, they are considered foreign national, they fall into that category. Methods of disclosure again include fax, telephone discussion, email communications, computer data disclosure, face-to-face discussions, training sessions, tours which involve visual inspection. Now, everybody likes to show off what they do, right? Especially in the manufacturing world, they like, they put their parts out in a display case. Well, lots of companies have, I've walked into lots of companies, I've seen their display case, and sitting in there are, missile components or propulsion components, and they don't realize, hey, everybody walking in can see that. That's visual inspection of an ITAR control item. Let's see, license requirements for dissemination of information does not apply if one of the 4 exclusions applies. So you can't get a license if, or you don't need a license if, you know, there's a public domain exclusion, meaning that the information or technology exists in the public eye, and, you know, anybody can have access to it. If there is a specific education exclusion, so there's the documents that govern ITAR, they list, you know, several education exclusions. If there's a fundamental research exclusion, again, that falls under the ITAR or the EAR rules and regulations, or if there's an employment exclusion, that's typically ITAR only. Under the ITAR, the fundamental research exclusion is a subset of the public domain exclusion. So if you're, you know, if you're trying to figure out what falls under that research, you're going to start at public domain. Export controls don't apply if the information and research are already published and publicly available from libraries, bookstores, or newsstands, trade shows, meetings, seminars in the US that are open to the public, published in certain patent applications, websites accessible to the public, or courses listed in the university catalog of a general nature. Now, the people who are putting these things together have a requirement to make sure that they're not including ITAR and EAR, but you know, once it makes it into this and it's been entered into the public domain, if you were then to share that information and you could, you know, somebody said, hey, what are you doing? And you say, look, I bought that at the library. You know, now you're not going to be held responsible for sharing something that you got out of the library. Education exclusions. So with the ITAR, there's no license required to share with foreign nationals information concerning general scientific, mathematic, or engineering principles commonly taught in universities, or information in the public domain. So we kind of touched on that, right? Basic physics, basic math, you can share, but you know, how this bomb flies through the air, you can't share, right? EAR is similar, but pertains to materials included in courses found in the course catalog of accredited institutions. And students using controlled equipment to conduct research should be registered for a research credit class. And again, there's rules inside the ITAR and EAR on how to get that registration, you know, how to go about that. Fundamental research exclusions, you know, no license is required to disclose to foreign nationals information which is published, which we kind of talked about, and which is generally accessible or available to the public through, for example, fundamental research in science and engineering at universities where resulting information is ordinarily published and shared broadly in the scientific community. So again, yeah, if you're ever challenged with this, the bad thing is that, you know, the burden of proof is going to be on you to say, hey, yes, this is public or it's not. You know, you're gonna have to cite where you found this stuff potentially, but you know, there are some exceptions to that. And then, you know, if you want to reference the NSTD 189, we can look that up. That's going to talk about, you know, where you know, the kind of what the, you know, what's published or what's considered public domain and what's not. Let's see, the exclusion, the fundamental research exclusion is destroyed or invalid if the university accepts any contract grant that forbids the participation of foreign nationals. So you don't need to get that if you can't have foreign nationals involved in contract. If it gives a sponsor a right to approve publications resulting from the research. So, you know, that, you know, if they have that approval, if they have that authority, then the exclusion is, you know, invalid, destroyed, or otherwise operates to forbid participation in research and or access and disclose the research results. So if you've got provisions that forbid participation in that research by those foreign nationals, by you know, those control groups, then you don't need that exclusion and they can be destroyed. This includes any side deals that may be made outside the terms of the initial award, which are generally frowned upon, just so you know. Like, they kind of want, typically they want to know if you get a prime contract, they want to know that you've got controls in place throughout a controlled, you know, chain, supply chain or chain of custody. No license is required to share covered technical data with a foreign national who is not a national of a prohibited country, who is a full-time bona fide UMSP employee, who has a permanent address in the US while employed, and who agrees in writing to not to share covered technical data with any foreign national. So you don't need a license if all four of those things apply. Providing service to a foreign national, ITAR and EAR prohibits assisting and training foreign nationals anywhere in the design, development, use, testing, etc. of controlled equipment without a license from Commerce or state. So if it's you can't train a foreign national how to fly an F-16 unless you get this license, right? There are no clear exclusions for safe harbors from the requirement to obtain license for foreign nationals to use controlled equipment. However, it is reasonable to maintain that the education exclusion applies if the student uses the equipment as part of a program of instruction. So again, there's not that they don't really clearly say what what falls into what is considered safe harbor for or against, but if it's part of that education program and they're using it as instruction only, then typically you're going to be okay. Again, without clear requirement, it makes that difficult to enforce, but it's kind of a gray line there. OFAC restrictions prohibit the transfer of anything of value to the provision and the provision of services to countries subject to U.S. sanctions, boycotts, etc., without a license. So, for the longest time, we had trade embargoes with Cuba, and it was illegal to buy Cuban cigars. Now you can do that because that embargo has been lifted or the sanctions have been lifted. Right now, we've got similar sanctions with pretty much anything going to Russia, given the current conflict. And OFAC is going to control that stuff. Sanctions can be complicated and they can vary across countries. So just because a country has sanctions doesn't mean that all of the that we can't buy or sell anything from them. They might have sanctions on certain products or certain regions or certain whatever. It's all how they write those OFAC restrictions when they get implemented. Some examples could be conducting surveys, interviews in boycotted countries and providing marketing and business services to persons in boycotted countries. Those are some of the examples that might not necessarily get seen as violating a trade embargo or violating a sanction. Other examples of service are, talk about that, providing marketing, creating new information materials at the behest of persons in a boycotted country, and engaging in the service of persons in a boycotted country to develop new information materials. This list changes, but at the time that this was created, again, 2021, this is probably the biggest change. These were the OFAC restricted companies or countries at the time. Really, the purpose of this slide is to show you that, for the up-to-date listing, you can go to the www.treasury.gov offices. And I'll share this slide to all, everybody who participated on as a link to my website. This whole PowerPoint will be available. So if you ever want to see if you can trade or not trade, hit up that website there. Requirements of a license to ship controlled equipment out of the US. So again, ITAR, EAR, OFAC doesn't say that you absolutely can never ship anything, but if you're going to ship things that fall into their lists or categories, you have to be permitted to do so. And the way you get permitted is by applying for a license. A license is required to ship equipment controlled by ITAR to any foreign country. Now, when we were at conflict, like when we had troops in Afghanistan, guarantee we were shipping stuff to Afghanistan to get to our troops. Well, how did we do that? Well, we applied for a license. We did it the way the ITAR says you're supposed to. There are a few exclusions or exceptions, and it can take months to obtain a license from state. When we're talking ITAR, that can be a very long time. We have to notify either the export compliance or the Office for Sponsored Programs as early as possible. That's kind of, that's on the exporter. If you have a due date to ship on Friday and your license takes 6 weeks, well, you should have been applying for that license 6 weeks ago or more. Requirement of a license to ship continued. The license may be required to ship equipment out of the US under the EAR, depending on whether the equipment is controlled, where it's being sent, and whether an exception applies. A license may be required to ship software out of the US, and that one, that one can get a lot of companies in trouble because a lot of companies put these dual use or possibly even military application software on their website as a downloadable link. And if anybody can click on it and download it into a country that is export controlled or banned, well, now you, as the provider of the information, have a violation. The process to classify equipment under EAR is very tedious, detailed, and time consuming. You should contact the RCIPM early if you need to do this. There is a presumption under the export control law and regulation that any and all shipments of equipment and provisions of service to countries subject to US sanctions, boycotts, purpose, or persons in those countries are illegal. So basically that's a way of saying, if we have sanctions with a company or a country and you ship to them, that's a crime. Laptop exclusion. A lot of companies send people overseas with their laptops. There's some potential risks there. Excluding embargoed countries, faculty who wish to take their laptops out of the country to use university project that qualifies as fundamental research may be able to do so under the license exception for temporary export. If the laptop meets the requirements for tools of trade and is under control of the faculty member. So under control basically means that you have it on your person at all time. There is an exception for leaving them in laptops while you're going out to dinner, but even that that it needs to be in a secure location while it's locked up in a room. That I believe is going to be changing on the next revision because we just there's too much technology out there and there's too much snooping going on in certain countries that even if it's locked up, there's ways for people to get data off of that stuff. So more to come on that. If you're gonna be exporting, with technology especially, you have to have a technology control plan. It's required for licensing. It describes safeguards for protecting controlled technology. So what kind of IT access, what kind of building access, data access. It should have a commitment in the form and compliance program. It should have a physical security plan, some sort of badging access, visitor logs, etc. You should have information security plan. So again, IT access, technical discussions, clean desk policy, data. Some companies, I've been in some companies, their clean desk policy is no joke. At the end of every single day, every piece of paper, every post-it note, everything is cleared off their desk and locked away. Just because, that's the significance of the information that they manage every day. It has to be secured. Personnel screening, review of lists, background checks, etc. You have to have training and awareness as part of your technology control plan, as well as self-assessment and corrective action. Some time considerations to keep in mind. Averaging processing times for licenses when you're applying to EAR. Here's what they list, but we know that through the pandemic and through now this this labor shortage and some of the other things that are going on, these are just ballparks. So I would suggest if you're going to work closely with EAR, ITAR, or OFAC, you reach out as early as possible, but you can definitely expect a minimum of 45 days for EAR, 90 days for ITAR, and 60 to 90 days for OFAC, but this one can be much longer. The validity of your license, if you've got a license for EAR to export, it's good for 2 years. ITAR is 4 years, and OFAC is 1. And your license has to include your provisos as well as any limitations. The licensing requirements, you're going to have ongoing oversight. You're going to have, manage your self-assessments. you're responsible for any modifications. Record keeping, you have to keep those records 5 years past their expiry. So, again, if we have a 4-year expiry, you got to keep it for another 5. And then you have reporting requirements. Kind of touched on the reporting, some of the reporting requirements, but again, refer to your, ITAR or EAR CFR sections to find out your specific reporting requirements. Termination of export privileges. So if you have a non-compliance, some things that could occur, you might get your export privileges terminated, and that can be temporarily or permanently. You can have a suspension or disbarment from government contracting. So if your business relies on government contracts, and you get these non-compliances, it can be pretty substantial. You might have to go through some voluntary disclosure violations to serve as a mitigating factor in deciding penalties. So this is kind of where one of those cases where if they find a non-compliance, they're gonna do an investigation, but really what they're gonna want is they're gonna want you to do your investigation, give your voluntary disclosure and say, okay, yes, we did a root cause. We found that, just like this one instance, we had all these other instances. They want to know that you're coming forward with that so that they can determine what the penalty should be, right? Hiding that stuff is going to make it a lot easier for them to say that you're a willful violator than if you do your own investigation and come forth with that information. Penalties, again, are continued. If it's a willful violation, it's criminal. It can be $1 million for a university or company under, we're specifically talking about EAR here. It can be $250,000 per violation for individuals and up to 10 years in prison. So this one, if a lot of people just say, oh, the company's going to get in trouble. No, the individual actually has criminal, potentially be criminally charged, $250,000 per violation. So if you sent 300 emails that all violated the EAR, that's 250,000 times 300, and 10 years in prison times 300. So they're pretty strict on that for willful violators. Civil can be $12,000 per violation for individuals and for the university or corporation. ITAR, again, these ITAR is the strict ones, right? They're a little bit harder to work with, and they're going to press you harder for, to see if you're that willful violator, because again, they apply to defense, and their penalties are $1 million for the university, which was the same as EAR, and up to $1 million per violation for the individual, as well as that 10 years in prison. Civil violations there can be $500,000 per violation for individuals and the university or company. Penalties for OFAC, again, talking willful, a fine of no more than $1 million for companies, a fine of no more than $100,000 for individuals, including corporate officers, and up to 10 years in prison. A fine of $55,000 for each violation by any person civilly can be assessed. So, that's kind of the scary slide. A lot of people see that, like, oh my gosh, what are we going to do? Again, we're focused on the willful violators there. So that doesn't mean that you don't need to have controls. It just means that you're going to be looked at differently if you are selling secrets than if somebody's sending emails and doesn't know that they're not supposed to. Some red flags, things that can help protect you, is pay attention to, does your project involve any travel to a foreign country? If it does, let's review the ITAR. Let's review the EAR requirements. Does it require the use of proprietary confidential information? Sometimes those proprietary and confidential statements can be in weird places in your statement of work or in your design package or whatever. So do a good review. If that jumps out anywhere, let's look at the ITAR and EAR. Do you have to ship equipment to a foreign country? Do you have to collaborate with foreign colleagues in foreign countries? Are you training any foreign nationals on using any equipment? Are you working in a country subject to a U.S. boycott? Does the request for proposal, is it marked or stamped export controlled? That one is, that one's a nice big red flag. It usually has if it's on a blueprint, it's usually a nice big box that says export controlled with, its listing of whether or not it falls in the ITAR or EAR. Is the sponsor demanding pre-approval rights over publications or the participation of foreign national students? So again, another red flag. University and PI responsibilities. So private entities should, or PI should review research programs for potential EAR ITAR issues. You should classify your research, find your ECCN number. So your ECCN number is that code in the EAR that tells you whether or not it is or is not a controlled item, and check your munitions list in the ITAR. So ECCNs are in your EAR, munition list items are in the ITAR. If you're planning to hire a foreign national, check the regulations to see if a license may be required for your research. At the contract stage, the Office for Research Compliance or Office for Sponsored Program will check for restrictive clauses that would eliminate the fundamental research exemption. Remember, we talked about the elimination requirements a few slides back. You have to document any exceptions. You got to keep those records for 5 years. Again, your license is valid for 2 years, so that's 5 years past the expiry of your license. Discuss questions with the Office for Research Compliance or the Office sponsored programs before the project begins to see if a license are needed. Again, it can take 2 to 6 months or longer for EAR and ITAR. OFAC licenses can easily take a year to obtain. Has the subject of export controls, publication restriction, or restrictions on the use of foreign nationals of the project arisen in any form, whether it be discussions, program announcements, text, etc., in connection with this proposal, right? You ask that question at the beginning of your process. Will the project involve an agreement or collaboration with any foreign entity or foreign national? Again, ask that early in the process. Will the project involve shipping equipment out of the U.S.? Will the project involve use of proprietary or confidential information or materials from the sponsor or any third party? These questions here, if I was going to engage with something that a new program and it might work in these ITAR EAR spaces, this would be my checklist. I mean, before I even started, I would go through these questions. Essential elements of a compliance program. So again, if the answer to those questions is yes, you're going to need to have some compliance. Some essential elements of that are a top-level commitment statement. So basically, that's a couple of sentences that says, "Hey, the leaders of this team, the management, whoever's responsible for this is our commitment. We're going to enforce this compliance. We're going to adopt that, empower our people, et cetera, et cetera." You have to have an empowered official responsible for compliance. So that's somebody who, regardless of other demands, right? In a manufacturing setting, this is somebody who, they're not responsible for on-time delivery. They're not responsible for, how you make the part. They are responsible for ensuring compliance. And above all else, that is their role. They have the authority to ensure compliance before anything else goes. You might have a provision in your, or you should have a provision on when and where to get expert legal counsel. You have to define your roles and responsibilities. You have to outline your procedures. You have to determine your needs assessment. So what does the project need? What does your facility need? What's your organization need, et cetera? You have to have provisions for training and awareness. Self-assessment. So this is a kind of a gauge, as well as audit throughout the process. You have to have all these provisions in place. You also have to have a centralized administration and oversight. So who's going to administer, who's going to be responsible for getting the licenses, and who's going to be responsible for overseeing the various steps of the things you do. You have to have application of uniform policies and procedures. So you can't have one set of rules for one group and another set for another group. They need to be uniform across your organization or across the program. You have to perform controlled research in separate secure spaces. So if you can't have your controlled research just in an open environment. Again, that's that visual inspection control. You have to promote compliance through awareness. You have to focus on compliance. or your compliance program has to focus on compliance, has to have good record keeping and documentation of decision-making process, and encourage prompt disclosure. That's kind of the end of the slide. So I know we covered a lot of stuff there. One part that this slide didn't go into is how to register to be ITAR, or how to get yourself ITAR registered. So OFAC and EAR don't require you to be registered to work in that space. But if you're handling ITAR components, again, that's that military defense type stuff. You may have a requirement either flowed down to you by your organization, your university, or your customers to become ITAR registered. And that process is not a very complicated process at all. It's there's a form that you have to fill out. It is the It is the DS-2032 statement of registration. You're gonna fill this form out in its entirety to the best of your knowledge, and you're gonna go to the DDTC website and submit it. Now, with that, there's a $2,550 fee to become ITAR registered, and that's paid annually. And part of the registration, process is you're going to fill out some information on your organization. Who are your primaries, who are your officers, and there's going to be an investigation into who these people are, and whether or not they're blacklisted or banned or whatever. If everything checks out, you don't have any issues there, then they're going to grant you a registration letter. It's going to have a registration number on it, and your customers may ask for evidence of that before they send you technical data or product that falls under the ITAR requirements. So again, that's not going to apply to everybody, but it will generally apply to manufacturers in defense, and it might actually be a requirement for certain programs for university and educational use as well. So that's kind of the spiel. Do we have any questions, or did I go over anything too fast? All right, no news is good news. So I'm gonna.
Eric, can you share how you facilitate this process, or your role in making this easier for companies?
Sure. So my company, we're a consulting agency, and we primarily work with manufacturers, but we can work with universities or other groups as well. And what we do is we actually help create the policies and procedures. We've got some bare bones templates, but we actually work with you specific to your programs to put the adequate controls in based on the work you do. And we provide all the training and all the documentation on how to become compliant. We also assist with self-assessments and auditing. So, that self-assessment is usually an upfront initial approach to assess your current controls and say, hey, where are our gaps, right? So, most companies, if they have any kind of secrets at all that they want to keep, they've got some controls that happen to align with the requirements of ITAR and EAR, but there's often lots of gaps too if they don't regularly work that space. So we help them find those gaps, and then we help them come up with a plan on how to close those gaps. And some of that might be technology, some of that might just be policy, but we help identify all those weaknesses, and work with them to get them closed. We can also help with the registration process. If you want to register with the DDTC, we can do interviews, fill out forms, get submittal. We can help with applying for licenses for a product or information that's going to be shared. So we like to be a holistic resource when it comes to being ITAR compliant. But so really, from that initial assessment all the way through maintenance of your programs, like to support all that.
Thank you.
Of course. Anything else before I stop recording? All right, well, thank you guys for attending. I am going to post this on my company website, and everybody who signed up for this today will get an email later today with information on how to access this, as well as other these webinars that we've done in the past. And you'll also, if you checked OK for future for us to be able to send you information in the future, then you'll also be signed up for any upcoming webinars, which we typically like to do once a month. So if you did check no and you want to be signed up, just reply to the email that you'll get today and say, hey, I do want to be signed up. Other than that, thank you guys for your time. I really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you in our upcoming events.